The motorcade pulled up to the military hospital, its flashing lights casting brief reflections against the rain-slicked pavement. The air was thick with anticipation as former President Donald Trump stepped out of the black SUV, his familiar silhouette outlined by the glow of the hospital entrance. The crowd that had gathered, doctors, nurses, patients, stirred with hushed murmurs. Some were surprised to see him here. Others, veterans with deep lines on their faces, simply watched, with quiet reverence. Trump adjusted his suit jacket and strode inside. No cameras, no press, just the echoes of his footsteps down the sterile hallway. The hospital staff directed him to a private ward where a group of wounded soldiers had been recovering. Some had lost limbs. Others bore wounds that ran deeper than the eye could see. As he entered, the room fell silent. A young man, no older than 25, sat in a wheelchair near the window, his right leg missing from the knee down. His uniform jacket, now more of a keepsake than a daily wear, was draped over the chair's armrest. His hands clenched as he tried to brace himself, his face unreadable. Trump walked over, placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder and said, "You're tougher than most people will ever understand." The soldier blinked, his jaw tightening. Then without a word, Trump knelt. He knelt beside the young man's chair, his hand still firm on his shoulder. The room collectively held its breath. "I should be the one standing for you," Trump said, his voice low but filled with a rare sincerity. The young soldier's lips parted, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, his eyes glistened with something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time: recognition. Not just as a soldier, but as a man who had given something that could never be returned. Then Trump did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small gold challenge coin, one reserved for only the most exceptional service members. He placed it in the soldier's palm and closed his fingers around it. "You're not forgotten. None of you are." By now, several in the room had tears in their eyes. A nurse bit her lip. A doctor cleared his throat. Even the hardened warriors among them looked away, swallowing hard. Trump stood, shaking hands, speaking with each soldier, hearing their stories, thanking them one by one. He wasn't here for politics, he wasn't here for a photo op. He was here because these men and women had given everything. As he left the room, one of the older veterans, his chest adorned with decades of medals, called out, "Thank you for remembering us." Trump paused at the doorway, glanced back, and gave a small nod. "No," he said. "Thank you." And then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a room full of soldiers who, for the first time in a long time, felt seen. The room remained silent long after Trump had left. The soldiers, nurses, and doctors stood frozen, absorbing the moment. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Others stared at the challenge coin still clutched in the young soldier's trembling. And a nurse finally exhaled and whispered, "I've never seen anything like that." The young soldier in the wheelchair swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the coin as if it were a lifeline. He had seen politicians visit before. Some shook hands, some gave speeches, but none had knelt before him. None had acknowledged what he had lost in such a personal way. Across the room, an older Marine veteran with silver in his hair and deep scars on his arms gave a slow, approving nod. "That's respect," he said gruffly. "Real respect." The door opened again. For a moment the room held its breath, thinking he had returned. But it was just a staff member, bringing in a folded American flag that had been gifted to the hospital. The timing, however, felt significant. One of the younger medics, usually composed and professional, discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. Meanwhile, outside, Trump's motorcade remained parked longer than expected. He had stepped away from the main entrance and was speaking with a group of Gold Star families who had come to the hospital for a support meeting. He shook hands, listened, and even embraced a grieving mother who clutched a photograph of her son, her shoulders shaking. A young girl, no older than 7, tugged at his sleeve. Her father had been a soldier, one who never came home. Trump knelt again, eye level with her, and asked for her name. She hesitated, but then whispered, "Emily." "You must be very strong," he told her. "Your dad would be proud of you, E.T.U. bit her lip, nodded, and without warning wrapped her small arms around him. The Secret Service agent stiffened, but Trump didn't move away. Instead, he let the child hold on to him for as long as she needed. When she finally pulled back, he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small pin shaped like the American flag. He placed it in her tiny hand. "Whenever you feel sad, hold this. And remember, your dad is a hero." Emily clutched the pin to her chest. Her mother, standing nearby, couldn't hold back her tears anymore. As Trump finally returned to his vehicle, an older veteran in a worn-out hat raised a shaky salute. Trump, just before stepping inside, returned it with precision, and then he was gone. But inside that hospital, in the hearts of the wounded, the grieving, and the forgotten, something had shifted. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about fame. It was about something far greater: remembrance, respect, and the unbreakable bond of those who serve. As the motorcade pulled away, the hospital remained in a hush, as if something sacred had just passed through. The young soldier in the wheelchair kept his eyes fixed on the challenge coin in his hand. He ran his fingers over the embossed emblem, his mind racing with memories, some of pain, some of pride. He had been through the worst, had lost more than he thought he could endure, but in that moment, he didn't feel forgotten. A nurse approached him gently. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, blinking as if waking from a trance. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Yeah, I think I am." Down the hallway, the doctors and medical staff whispered amongst themselves, still processing what they had witnessed. A surgeon, a man known for his stoic demeanor, turned to his colleague and murmured, "I've been here 20 years. Never seen something like that before." Meanwhile, outside, a group of reporters had caught wind of the visit, but there had been no speech, no press conference, only whispers of what had happened inside. A few hospital staff members shared what they had seen, their voices tinged with emotion. A journalist, notebook in hand, hesitated before writing anything down. This wasn't a campaign stop, was it? A nurse, overhearing the question, shook her head. "No," she said softly. This was something different. As Trump's motorcade drove through the city, he sat in silence, gazing out the window. His aides knew better than to interrupt him when he was in this kind of mood. He wasn't one for long-winded reflections, but moments like this lingered with him. Finally, after a while, he turned to one of his aides and said, "Make sure they get what they need. The hospital, the families, the vets." The aide nodded, immediately pulling out a notepad. Trump looked back out the window, his expression unreadable. But deep in his mind, he knew this was the part of the job that mattered most. Not the debates, not the headlines, not the noise. It was about the people who had sacrificed everything. Back at the hospital, the young girl, Emily, sat in the waiting room with her mother, still clutching the small American flag pin in her hand. She looked up at her mom and asked, "Do you think Daddy saw?" Her mother wiped away a tear, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I think he did." And as the rain drizzled lightly outside, the world kept moving, unaware that within those hospital walls, something profound had happened. Something that wouldn't make the front page news but would live on in the hearts of those who were there. That night, the hospital remained unusually quiet. The soldiers who had been visited replayed the moment in their minds, unable to shake the feeling that, for once, someone had seen them. Not just as patients, not just as statistics, but as men and women who had given their all. The young soldier in the wheelchair stared at the ceiling of his room, the weight of the challenge coin still pressing into his palm. He had spent weeks feeling like a fraction of the man he once was, but now there was something different, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Across the hall, the old Marine veteran sat on the edge of his bed, slowly polishing the medals on his nightstand. His hands, once steady and sure, trembled with age, but tonight, they felt strong again. And Emily, the little girl who had lost her father, curled up in bed with the small American flag pin pressed tightly to her chest. In her dreams, she saw her father standing tall, smiling at her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like he was still with her. Miles away, Trump sat in his private quarters, flipping through reports and briefing notes. His mind kept drifting back to the faces he had seen that day. The wounded, the grieving, the strong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note. It had been given to him by one of the soldiers just before he left. With deliberate hands, he unfolded it and read the simple words scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for remembering us." For a long time he sat there, the paper resting on the desk in front of him. Then, with a slow breath, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. No cameras had captured today's visit. No speeches had been made. But he knew, deep in his gut, that today had mattered. Not for the headlines, not for the politics, just for the people. And sometimes that was enough. The next morning, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm. Doctors making their rounds, nurses checking vitals, soldiers going through their grueling rehab sessions. But there was something different in the air, something unspoken yet deeply felt. The young soldier in the wheelchair wheeled himself to the physical therapy room, the challenge coin still tucked into his pocket. Today, for the first time since his injury, he asked his therapist a question he hadn't dared to before. "How long until I can try a prosthetic?" The therapist raised an eyebrow, surprised. "We can start fitting you as soon as you're ready." The soldier took a deep breath, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. "I think I'm ready." Across the hospital, the old Marine veteran sat by the window, watching the rain drizzle against the glass. A nurse approached him with his morning medication, but he waved her off for a moment. "You know," he said, rubbing a hand over his grizzled chin, "I've been coming here for years. First time I felt like someone really saw us, not just another politician passing through." The nurse smiled softly. It meant a lot to everyone. The Marine nodded, staring out at the gray sky. Damn right it did. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Emily sat at the kitchen table, twirling the American flag pin between her fingers. Her mother watched from the sink, noticing how careful her daughter was with it, as if it were made of gold. Finally, Emily looked up. "Mom, do you think I could take this to school? Show my class?" Her mother hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Your dad would love that." That same morning, inside the former president's private residence, Trump sat at his desk reviewing a stack of documents. His mind was focused, but every so often, he found himself glancing at the small folded note he had received at the hospital. "Thank you for remembering us." He had received thousands of notes, letters, and messages throughout his life, but something about this one lingered. Maybe it was because it came from a soldier who had given more than most would ever understand. Maybe it was because he knew how often these men and women were overlooked. Or maybe, deep down, it was because he understood something that couldn't be put into words. He picked up the note again, tapping his fingers against the desk. Then, without hesitation, he reached for his phone. "Get me the VA secretary," he told his aide. "I want an update on those hospitals, and I want to know exactly what they need." There was a brief pause on the other end before the aide responded, "Right away, sir." Trump leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't done. There was more to do. Because remembering them wasn't enough. He had to act.